Hello, everyone. This is the Free American Press with your host, Alexander, and today we're joined by my good friend, Joseph P. Farrell. Hello, Joseph. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me back, Alexander.
I'd like to introduce Joseph P. Farrell for you all. So, Joseph Farrell has a doctorate in patristic from the University of Oxford and pursues research in physics, alternative history, and science and strange stuff. I'd like to focus on the subject of transhumanism and how it relates to current events, such as the
Oh,
rise
wow.
of digital currencies and food supply and much more. You specifically wrote a book called Transhumanism, where you investigate the hidden history and who's
Right.
setting the agenda for the transhumanistic civilization. Can you tell us a little bit about that book?
Well, I wrote it with a friend of mine, Dr. Scott DeHart, and who also is a an Oxford uh, person. Um, when we started looking at transhumanism, we obviously consulted some of the more popular presenters of the idea, Kurt Kurzweil and Joel Garou and people like that. And as we got further into it, we realized that all that transhumanism was it was an updating, of very, very old esoteric and occult agendas. Not the least of which is the idea that there were four atoms, okay, four heads of the human race, but each head is degraded a little bit. So if you can think of it as a hierarchy, at the very bottom of the hierarchy, you have animal Adam, which is us.
Yeah,
Okay. Then the next step up, you have vegetable Adam. The next step up from that, you have mineral Adam. And then at the very top, you had androgynous Adam. In other words, an Adam that was neither male nor female, but both.
right.
And in trying to promote transhumanism, what they're trying to tell you is that that old system of thinking about how the material humanity came into existence, it fell through those layers of materiality. So what they're trying to do is ascend back up the ladder.
Mm.
And the way they're trying to ascend back up the ladder is through crazy, kooky, quote unquote science experiments. In other words, if you look at what modern scientists are doing, what are they doing? Well, the first thing they're doing is they're trying to create mis misgenetic. Oh, I can't even remember the word, miscegenation. They're trying to combine one species with another. So we've seen all of these very strange experiments, particularly coming out of the Orient, Japan, places like that, where they're trying to combine humanity with plants. Okay. So, in other words, there's your first step on that ladder back up, because what's the atom right above animal atom? Well, it's vegetable atom. And then we read, you can easily find this, think about Elon Musk. He wants to put neural nets, he wants to put computer chips into, into the human brain and all sorts of other stuff. So, in other words, the next step up for the transhumanist is to merge man and machine, make us cyborgs. So, that's the next thing. And what's at the top of it? Well, at the top of it, there's this idea that humanity was originally created in androgyne. In other words, we had both sexes. And by the way, the creation story of the Mayan Indians in Mesoamerica, the Popol Vuh, actually states that that's how we were first created. And you can find certain manuscripts of the Palestinian Talmud that says the same thing. And in some very early versions of the first chapter of Genesis, where you have that verse, male and female created he them. In some versions of that verse, the verse reads, male and female created he him. So you even find the idea that humanity was originally created as an androgyne in some Jewish and Christian tradition as well. So in other words, what they're trying to do is get back to this androgyne. So where are we now? Well, I think it highly illustrative that they think that they can alter the sexuality of an individual merely by a linguistic proclamation. In other words, I'm old enough, you're probably not old enough to remember when this happened, but I'm old enough to remember when government forms or applications at a, to go to work, get a job, where there were two boxes that said sex, male or female, and you checked one of those boxes,
Right.
depending on what you were. But then they changed the boxes from sex to gender.
Hmm.
And when they did that, I thought, uh-oh, that's the game. I was, I'm tooting my own horn here. I was way ahead of the game because I knew what they were going to try and do on the basis of gender. Gender is a linguistic property. If you studied Spanish or French or German or Russian or Latin or Greek, on and on we go. Nouns in those languages are assigned a gender. They're either masculine, feminine, and in some cases neuter, neither one. Okay. So gender is a linguistic characteristic. So when they started assigning gender to humanity, what they were signaling is that we are going to try to confuse everybody about their sexuality via language, via gender. So now where are we? We're in a society where these ideas have taken such hold that you can simply proclaim yourself, in the ultimate nutty idea, you simply proclaim yourself to be a woman, and hey, you can go participate in women's sports if you want to, which is is lunacy. I mean, there's no other way to put it. It's nothing but lunacy. But my point here is that the transhumanist agenda is being worked out right in front of our eyes.
Right.
So we'd better recognize it for what it is. And like all of these kind of kooky progressive projects, the problem with them is you cannot get them to tell you, well, how much is enough? Because the process itself, keeping the process going ad infinitum is what empowers them. So, in other words, this has no goal. It never will. The goal is to keep you involved in the process itself. Look at how many times they've changed the language on us,
Right.
and you've got to keep playing catch up to signal that you're going along with their agenda by using the language that they use. So this is a very old game, and I just tell people quit using the language. It's still the Netherlands, it's still the United Kingdom, it's still the United States, and it's still the Ukraine. That's proper English. All of a sudden, politicians decided that the English should be like Slavic languages with no definite articles. It's just nonsense.
So language is very important then.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You signal, this is something that um, back when I was teaching in seminary years and years ago, I tried to get my students to understand. There is in Christian history a form of kind of twisted theology called Gnosticism. And the way that Gnosticism worked, and really when you study it, it's nothing but a technique of subversion. You can take the techniques of Gnosticism and apply them pretty much anywhere to any type of institution, be it religious, political, or what have you. So the techniques of Gnosticism are basically nothing but how do I subvert an institution? Well, one of the ways that is up front and center in all Gnostic systems is they insist on using language in a peculiar way,
Yeah.
apart from the vast majority of the way that people use it. It's either that or they will actually invent a kind of language that only they know. And you signal, the key point here is you signal your acquiescence to that Gnostic agenda by using the terms that they dictate in the way that they dictate should be used. So, in other words, a little thing, a little thing in language use can suddenly blossom into something very, very significant culturally. So, I remember when we quit using the masculine rhetorical pars pro toto usage. In other words, when you say man in certain contexts in the English language, you don't mean to exclude women. What you're using man for is to signify humanity. All right. But at a certain point, when all of this hit back in the 1970s and 80s, they started to tinker with the language. Well, you had to start saying person, and all of this nonsense. Well, I refused then and I refuse now to go along with it because once you surrender the language, there's no stopping it. They will insist on everybody using their language regardless of what and how kooky it is. So yeah, I'm sorry. I don't think you can proclaim yourself to be a woman just because you've got, some transgender issues or whatever. I'm sorry, I don't. I'm a traditionalist curmudgeon.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good thing. So this transhumanism agenda, why do you think the main reason for them to do it? Like, what do they have to gain from doing this to
Power.
power?
Yeah, why does any minority insist on imposing its views on everybody else? Well, power. In other words, you have to understand that not having a goal, not being able to say how much is enough. This is something, by the way, a transgendered friend of mine told me. Just ask a progressive how much progressivism is enough, and they will have no answer because it's the process of insisting on progressivism that is itself what empowers them. So there can be no end to it.
Mm.
That's the problem. So it's the process that empowers these people. They have to uh, they have to get people to go along with it. What inevitably happens with movements like that is eventually they run up against the hard reality that most people don't think that way and don't want to. And eventually there's pushback. That's where we're at right now. The pushback is starting, but I don't think it's anywhere close to being a phenomenon that's exhausted yet. Nowhere close.
Yeah, I actually just saw recently that RFK Jr., who now is in the United States government, said
Mhm.
that he wants everyone in America to be having a wearable in 4 years. So, I don't know.
Yeah, well, again, what they're trying to do, and this disturbs me immensely. I think some sort of bargain was struck with Mr. Trump and certain factions in the deep state uh, to allow him back into office. And I think the bargain was more or less along the following lines. We'll let you pursue your social cultural agenda just so long as you pursue our agenda in putting in a massive surveillance state, which is what he's doing. So, some of the things he's doing are good things, and then there's the other flip side of, Palantir, this sovereign wealth fund with kleptocurrencies, as I like to call them. Some of these ideas I just shudder. So, I'm half and half right now on what I see happening.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think he's been doing a lot of really bad stuff with all this and the Genius Act. I want to get your
Oh,
thoughts on that.
look, anything that advances the surveillance state is something I'm opposed to because in the final analysis, what he's trying to build out is a beast system. So in other words, if you surrender the sovereignty that a physical medium of exchange gives you and the anonymity it gives you in transaction, and replace it with a system of digital currency. And I don't care uh, what magical hokum they cook up to sell this whole thing. The current hokum is, oh, we've got these state bullion depositories, and we're going to back your money with real gold, and we're going to give you a little card to transact with. So in other words, fake gold backing. But if if you surrender financial sovereignty to these people, then you don't have money. What you really have, and I'm foursquare with Catherine Austin Fitts here, what you really have is a corporate coupon, the value of which they can turn on or turn off or regulate at will and according to the occasion. So, in other words, if you're good little boys and girls, your dollars will be worth a little bit more when you go to spend them, and we'll let you spend them, in more places. If you're bad little boys and girls and don't agree with us, if you, Joseph P. Farrell, don't drop using the definite article when referring to the Ukraine, well, we're going to dock you so much value on your dollars in your bank account or prevent you from spending it altogether. And we've seen that already. We've seen people being debanked in some countries already. Canada, in recent memory, they're doing it in the United Kingdom. So you must insist on. First of all, I use cash anymore whenever I can.
Right.
I've cut down my debit card usage, so I barely use it when I'm out and around, grocery shopping or filling my car with gas or whatever. I use cash. And about the only time anymore that I do use a debit card is if I'm buying something online that I need. And even that I'm trying to cut down on. Um, I buy a lot of books, as you can see,
Yeah.
but I'm trying to go to bookstores and have them special order things for me rather than buy it online
Yeah.
because we've got to get away from this digital concentration camp, or that's where we're all going to end up in a digital concentration camp.
So when do you think they're gonna get rid of the physical dollars? When do you think they're gonna make that move?
Oh, I think they would have done it by now if they thought they could get away with it.
All right.
And they are trying. They are trying for all their worth in Europe to do so. And fortunately, people in Europe have woken up and are drawing back from that. And in this country, what they I think they quickly and correctly concluded that they would not be able to introduce a central bank digital currency. So what they've done, and I've watched this and tracked it uh, for at least a decade now, I'd say, in various blogs on my website. What they did was something very clever, and I'm very upfront about this. They had me hoodwinked at the beginning of this because what they're doing now is they're opening up these state bullion depositories. Texas was the first to open a state bullion depository. Come in, deposit your silver or your gold or your palladium or whatever it is in our state bullion depository, and you can have this certificate of deposit and go spend it. So at the beginning of this, I thought, well, this is interesting because what they're doing is they're trying to restore stability to the money supply. Good idea. And Utah followed up very quickly after that. Utah became the second state to do this. And now we have several states all over the country passing laws where they're removing sales tax on gold and silver. So, in other words, you can use them. They're trying to remonetize gold and silver, but there's a catch. And I just wrote about this catch in the two books that just came out, The Rialto Enrichment and The Rialto Enrichment Reconstructed, about the war between the states and the financial policy that the country initiated after the end of the war between the states. And the problem was, and I'm going to go around Harvey's barn here, and I hope people will bear with me because this is a complicated thing to explain. But I want people to see that the country has been here before, and has been put into these financial traps before, so don't fall for it this time, okay?
Yeah.
After the Civil War, what we have to remember is prior to the Civil War, the entire debt of the whole country, the budget for the whole government was $80 million. What happened as a result of the Civil War is that in the Union alone, just the Union, that debt had ballooned 1,600% to $1.3 billion in just 4 years. That's not counting the Confederacy's debt, which was a similarly sized debt of about $990 million. So, total it all together, the two sides in the Civil War racked up about $3 billion worth of debt, which is, several magnitudes of order above what we entered the Civil War with. So, as a result of this, look what happened. You had three different kinds of money circulating in the Union, all right? Just the Union. You had gold and silver specie, which quickly fled circulation because the government, the Union government, needed that gold and silver specie to conduct international trade.
Right.
So what remained in circulation within the Union was either monetized debt, in other words, money that had been printed and issued into circulation against federal government sovereign bonds, much like now, and then also the Lincoln greenback, which was simply money that was printed, decreed by Congress to be legal tender, and printed and circulated without any debt interest whatsoever. And of course, that ruined the Union's ability to get credit in the European financial markets because, they weren't having that system. It ballooned the money supply. And at the end of the war, then, this means that you've got very little specie in circulation. You've got some money in circulation that's monetized debt, like what we have now with our Federal Reserve notes. And then you had the Lincoln greenback, which was a considerable part of the circulating money, which wasn't backed by anything. So the Union, in several currency acts after the end of the Civil War, decided, well, if we're going to conduct international trade, we have to get the dollar back onto some sort of relationship with gold. And please note what I just said with gold,
Yeah.
because they demonetized silver. Okay. In other words, their policy was to deflate the currency. And we know that that was a deliberate policy because the Comstock silver lode over in your neck of the woods in Nevada had been discovered during the Civil War, and it would have been able to sustain a lot of circulating silver if they had bothered to want to monetize it. So, in other words, they just said, no, we're going to ignore all that. We're not going to circulate silver as money. We're going to reduce the amount of backing of the monetary supply. So now you had this inverted pyramid of a small amount of gold trying to prop up all those circulating notes that the Union had circulated during the Civil War. And remember, we're still leaving out the Confederate part of this, okay, where I'm just simplifying all of this. So what did they do? Well, they passed an act under Ulysses S. Grant called the Resumption Act. This was passed by Congress in 1875, just as about as he's ready to leave office in his first administration. And what the Resumption Act did, this flabbergasts me to this day, because what the Resumption Act did is it converted the Lincoln greenback into specie convertibility. In other words, it said, oh, we're going to honor those circulating Lincoln greenbacks. You can present them and get a gold coin for your $1 Lincoln greenback. We're going to back it. And remember, it was not backed initially. So what Congress did, I hope people really latch onto this. What Congress did is it converted the Lincoln greenback into Confederate money. Why? Because if you look at Confederate money, and I show the money in my books that just came out this year. If you look at Confederate money, there's a little declaration on every Confederate paper note bill. And it runs something to the effect of the Confederate States of America will pay to the bearer on demand X amount of dollars upon upon 2 years or 10 years after the ratification of a treaty of peace between the United States of America and the Confederate States of America. So, in other words, the Confederacy was issuing paper money that was a promissory note, that was a promise to pay with specie backing at a certain point after the end of the war. Okay. And that's what Congress converted the Union currency back into. In other words, this was the way for all those foreign financiers to put a lien on the labor of the South through the specie convertibility after the war. That's exactly what happened. Now, why is this important to this story about state bullion depositories today? Because what the Union had to do was remove and destroy a certain amount of Lincoln greenbacks in circulation to be able to restore the convertibility of the currency. The reason why is that had they tried to back all of that circulating currency on that narrow basis of gold, you may have gotten a couple of flecks of gold for your dollar, but that would have, basically meant no convertibility at all, unless you were super wealthy. Follow me?
Yeah.
This is what the modern state bullion depositories are doing. They are not withdrawing any of the circulating money. They're saying, oh, we're going to back that now. So, in other words, your Federal Reserve note might be worth a couple of flecks of very tiny little flecks of gold. But we have a magical tool now that we can compute how many little nano flecks of gold that dollar bill is worth, and it's called the computer.
Right.
So you deposit your money in our state bullion depository, and we'll give you a plastic card that you can use to transact when you go buy groceries. And when you go buy your groceries, those groceries that the grocer will take your plastic card for are now gold backed.
Hmm.
Gold backed. I mean, it's such a complete scam because what they're really doing is giving you a new electronic transfer system. Okay. We're giving you, Alexander, computer blips on a screen. You give us your hard assets.
All right.
and and now, we've got Mr. Trump's sovereign wealth fund, which I'm flabbergasted people haven't caught on to this because what's the hard assets he's tendering for and trading? Federal land, all that stuff out there in the American West. That's a hefty chunk of money.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. Yeah. So we're gonna make a sovereign wealth fund with kleptocurrencies as part of the portfolio. In other words, we're going to give you computer blips, you give us your hard assets. it's it's the same old game, and I just I'm dumbfounded that people can't see it. So, in other words, we're playing the same game that they played after the end of the war between the states. The difference is the policy that they're pursuing is different. They pursued a deflationary policy to get things back into balance after the war. But now we don't need to pursue the deflationary policy because we've got computers that can do all the calculating for us. Big problem there, and everybody that knows me knows what it is. It's called electromagnetic pulse.
Hmm.
What happens if you manage to find yourself suddenly, inexplicably, in a war with Russia
Right.
and the hydrogen bombs that they're dropping on the country wipe out all of those digital records? What happens then? You know, So I'm dumbfounded that people are falling for this. I really am. And I'm gonna keep screaming and complaining about it until people wake up and start using cash.
So what do you think will happen in 2033? Do you think it'll be similar to 1933?
You mean financially?
Yeah.
Uh it's you're asking me to make a prediction, and the trouble with making a financial prediction, Alex, and I'm not a finance guy. I want people to understand this right up front. I'm not a Catherine Austin Fitz or Martin Armstrong or any of those people. I just look at things, from a historian's point of view.
Right.
But for me, it's hard to predict what's going to happen that far out for one very fundamental reason that people really haven't latched onto yet. They know the fact, but they don't know the significance of the fact. In the 1970s, I was alive at the time. I remember when this was done. President Nixon took the United States completely off the post World War II Bretton Woods system. In other words, he completely removed the United States from the modified gold standard that the Bretton Woods system represented. And he replaced it with petrodollars and, fiat money. Now, that's the fact that everybody knows. What most people do not understand the significance of is what President Nixon did was an absolutely unique first in human history since approximately 2000 BC. In other words, we have not been in any situation where we are in a financial system that is completely fiat without any tie to actual production or commodity. And we've seen the ruinous results of a completely financialized system. So my point is not having any really good precedent for 4,000 years.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to predict what's going to happen. Anybody that tells you, and this is my 2 cents worth, anybody that tells you that they do know where we're going to be in 2033 is I have a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you cheap,
Right.
because they don't know. They may pretend to know, and they may come across as very confident, like they really know. But I have a problem with that the insiders themselves really don't have any good explanations for their financial policy. They're trying everything in the book to keep this system alive,
Yeah.
and it ain't working. We should get a clue that it ain't working. Just look at what we've been trying to do with Russia, Alex. We've been trying to sanction Russia into surrender. And the only thing that we've managed to do is make the Russian economy stronger.
Yeah.
So, you know, they haven't got a clue. We were sold the free trade bill of goods back at the tail end of the King George Herbert Walker Bush administration, and that hasn't worked out well either. So they don't know what they're doing. They really don't.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah, I know it's hard to make predictions, but do you think as of right now we're on track with the 2030 agenda, or do you think they're
Well,
not?
tell me what you're meaning by 2030 agenda,
The UN 2030 agenda
which is what?
it has a whole bunch of different things that it says that they want to do.
Well, I would have to know the specific things that the UN agenda says that they're going to do that we might be on track for or not on track for.
Like they
However,
like they want everything to be sustainable, and they want,
okay, the sustainability meme. The sustainability meme has been around since the 1970s, and it was a big central bank ploy. So I'm going to give you a little tidbit of information that you may not know about, and many people may not know about, as to what the sustainability thing is all about. Back in the 1970s, there were conferences of banksters, people like uh, Morris Strong, uh, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, as I like to call them.
the
Uh,
rotten.
you know, yeah, the Rockefellers, as I like to call them, and the Rothschilds, and they were funding and sponsoring these world wilderness congresses. Okay, that's the thing to remember. And this was in the 1970s, okay, about 50 years ago. And at one of these congresses, they made a mistake and they invited, for, as they will occasionally do, they will make a mistake and invite somebody that they think is one of them but isn't. So
Yeah.
they invited this accountant to attend, and he volunteered to pick people up at the airport and take them to the Congress, which he did. And he was amazed, at the people he's ushering to the from the airport to the Congress, Lord Rothschild and all these high muckety mucks. And then at the Congress, he said he was dumbfounded at what the plan was for sustainability. There's that magic word. Well, sustainability was just the code name for, again, the asset swap plan.
Mm.
What they were saying that they wanted to do was to monetize and collateralize the entire world's wilderness land and circulate money as on the basis of that collateralization. Follow me?
Yeah.
All over the world. So in other words, again, we're going to give you pieces of paper, you give us your hard assets.
All right.
It was another asset swap scheme. Now look at Trump's sovereign wealth fund. What is it? Well, part of it's going to be consisting of kleptocurrencies, as I like to call them, and part of it is going to be collateralization of all that federal land out in the American West. So, in other words, they're following exactly the same playbook, and they think that this is going to add stability and sustainability to the system. No, the only thing it does, my friends, is it empowers them. It keeps them and that whole system in power. And that system, please note, is a system based on a fiat currency that is supposedly backed by some hard collateral. And again, if you don't have a currency which is itself a hard collateral, then yeah, you've got some problems. Do you want to trust these people and their digital models and algorithms?
No.
No, no. You know, this is the whole problem with the digital age is we think that it's a technology that's the answer to everything. I can count on two hands the amount of flash crashes algorithmic trading computers have brought about since they started trading on the stock markets and
Yeah.
the commodities markets. Once you have computers involved, you are no longer using human beings for the risk and pricing assessment mechanism. And therefore, you're creating a market that is disconnected ultimately from human activity and reality. And this is the problem we better get through our thick heads. We're creating a nightmare. So, sustainability, yeah, they're going to talk that language because they've been talking it for 50 years, but it's a code for a good old asset swap scam and empower us even more scam. And I don't want anything to do with it.
Yeah, they just want our assets. That's
Yep,
definitely.
that's it. That's it exactly.
Yeah, that's crazy. So in your book, you talk about the Rockefellers in Argentina, and Argentina has been known for decades to be a major cattle farming country. Their beef has been known to be the best.
Uh-huh.
Yes, something has happened in the early 1980s. Can you tell us about that? And how is the food industry impacted by the transhumanistic agenda?
Well, which book of are you talking about of
The
mine? The
transhumanism.
transhumanism book?
Yeah,
Well, the problem with the transhumanist agenda, particularly as regards the food supply, and now I would add the medical supply to that,
yeah,
is that they are intent upon creating these cyborg creatures by merging us with animals and plants and minerals and computer chips and everything else as much as they can because they think that's the wave of the future. So it is not above them to doctor the food supply in order to do what? To vaccinate us, you know, long before COVID, they were already talking about putting vaccines covertly, incidentally, into GMO foods. So,
Wow.
in other words, just by eating, you're vaccinating yourself. And please note the covert part. We're not even going to bother telling anybody we're doing this. And by the way, if you're not familiar with it, we're already seeing some very weird viruses growing on the faces of rabbits in Colorado.
Hmm.
Go look at the pictures. They're horrifying.
Okay.
The food supply is a ready mechanism, and during the COVID plan scamdemic, what were they saying? Oh, well, we'll just put the vaccine in the GMO food supply so that even for non-vaxxers like me, you go out and eat something and bang, we're vaccinating you whether you like it or not. And they're talking about doing, and they have talked about doing the same thing via the medical supply. And now, in the craziest manifestation of their um, power lust, I just did a blog about how they want to coat dental floss with their vaccines. So, you're flossing your teeth and you're making little micro cuts into your gums, and bang, you're getting you're getting walloped with a bunch of nanotechnology as a result. So yeah, these people are nuts.
Yeah.
They want to do this, and they come right out and tell you that we'll do it by force. And much as I applaud some of Secretary Kennedy's stances on vaccines and autism and so on, the idea of hooking me up to a monitor that's going to monitor me 24/7 and have me hooked up to a database, no, I ain't doing it. I won't take any injections that they dictate I must take, and I will not be a part of their monitor system. And if they want to put me in a camp, that's fine. That's what they're going to have to do, because I'm not doing it.
Yeah. So what do you think of the Bill Gates plan to do vaccines for mosquitoes?
Again, it's the same thing. I mean, this guy is truly power hungry, because he's not only advanced that idea, he's also advanced the idea, well, we're going to find some way to vaccinate you surreptitiously, and we'll be able to download or your booster shot if you just wear our little implant. So, for those of you who've suffered the micro crap, pardon my French, but the micro crap weekly update to your Microsoft operating system software that takes forever and ever and ever. Just imagine having that whole corporation and its updating system connected to your health. You're walking merrily down the street, and then all of a sudden you go offline and stand there frozen while your update is being downloaded. These people are nuts. Want anything to do with Bill Gates and his downloadable vaccines? No. Want anything to do with Elon Musk and his neural net? No. And they always sell this, well, look at all the good it will do. Yeah, and I'm the curmudgeon out there saying, look at all the bad that it can do too, before you leap. It's a bad system that they're trying to impose. And again, it's that transhumanist agenda that, we're smarter than God, and we can tinker with the creation and improve it. It's nuts.
So how do you think we can stop this transhumanistic agenda? Because like this food, vaccines and food, that seems like you can't even really protect yourself.
You First of all, you have to communicate about it. You have to blog about it. You have to communicate about it. But you can't stop there. You've got to start complaining about it, and you've got to start making it very clear that as far as you're concerned or your family is concerned, you're not going to go along with it, and that they are going to have to force it, literally by force. Because what that does is it communicates to them there's a growing segment of the population that is not going to go along with this unless we have the force to compel them. And the problem is they are in the minority already.
All right.
So, in other words, it's that literally that kind of brinksmanship, but it's what's required and what it's going to take. We've been watching, I just saw before we started our talk, I've been watching the reaction in Europe to the migrant invasions for several years. We're now at the point where people in Europe, let's just take France as one example. Your average Frenchman is so fed up with Mr. Globaloney and the immigration policies, not to mention the war with Russia policies.
Yeah.
They're so fed up that Marine Le Pen, I don't know if you know who she is, but she is the leader of the most right wing party in France, the Front National.
Yeah.
And she is now leading President Macron and his and all other parties by 18%.
Wow. Okay.
So, in other words, the next presidential election in France, if it were held today, Marine Le Pen would be in the Elysee Palace, and Emmanuel Macron and his globaloni Rothschild crowd would be out on the streets looking for work.
Yeah.
The leading party in Germany right now, forget that nutcase that is their current chancellor. Where they dug him up is anybody's guess, but the leading party in Germany right now is the Alternative for Deutschland. And again, it's a right wing nationalist populist party that says we don't need any more migrants and we don't need another world war. Thank you very much. We've fought two of them. We don't need another one. So, yeah, you have these reactions all over Europe. So, what that's got to be communicating to Mr. Globaloney, and look how desperate Mr. Globaloney is, because he has to fix, rig, and cheat in elections now to get elected. That's how desperate they are.
And
Or attempt to assassinate President Trump, and that did. So,
it does seem like they cheat a lot in elections, like in Venezuela and
oh,
other.
of course they do. What do you trust communists?
No.
Do you trust socialists?
No.
No. So why would we start now?
Yeah.
And on top of that, do you trust voting machines? And I never have, not one little bit. And do both sides cheat? Yeah, you bet they do. So let's get rid of the voting machines and go back to paper ballots and records that we can trace and track. Yeah, this is the problem that Mr. Globaloney is in. His policies are not working, did not work, will not work, and everybody sees that, and they don't want to relinquish power. That's the problem.
Yeah,
That's
that's one thing that I've seen. It seems like Mr. Globaloney buys off both parties. I've seen that in the United States a lot.
sure, of course. Yeah.
And it's a little disheartening to see that they do that because then the people we fight back, but then they just do that.
Well, they rig the system any way they can.
Yeah.
But like all civilizations, at a certain point, you cannot, the Soviet Union found this out the hard way. At a certain point, you simply cannot govern with lies, falsehoods, deceits, and fraud because the system eventually collapses because everyone sees it is not working. And that's where we are right now. The system is not working. It is fundamentally flawed. There's too much corruption and so on and so forth. That's where we are. Um, Usually the way out of these systems is countries flirt with dictatorships and then that ultimately fails, or they successfully reverse course, but that's a very, very rare occurrence. So, where this is going to end up, I don't know. I really don't know. We're seeing in this country something that we have not seen since the end of the war between the states, and that is open talk in several states of secession. Your state, for example,
Mm.
there are several counties that just have had it with Sacramento and the rest of the state, and they want out. And I don't blame them. There are similar counties in Oregon that have had it with Portland, to be blunt, and that they want out. And again, I can't blame them. So the secession talk is something that should be signaling to the powers that be that yeah, people are getting pretty fed up. And now Mr. Trump has responded by creating this sudden response force for civil unrest of 600 people. Well, that is a clear signal that the power elite is getting very, very nervous.
Right.
Pardon me.
Yeah, so do you see the United States breaking up into different parts, or do you think that's not something they have in store for us?
Um, that's a very complex question. I can see a very strong possibility of it happening because this country is, as it's currently constituted, this country is at least two contradictory cultures, just like it was before the war between the states. You had and I'm going to be very blunt here, you had a virtue signaling, secular, Calvinistic, Puritan Yankee culture in New England that was bound and determined with violence, if necessary, to get rid of slavery. And on the other side of that divide, you had a very rural, agrarian, slaveholding, and at that time conservative South that wanted nothing to do with that secularized, money chasing culture of what they called those people, meaning the Yankee North. So you had two very different cultures. And here's the problem: those two very different cultures were there at the founding of the country. And the way they decided to deal or attempt to deal with two very contradictory cultures was to create a governmental process that would hold the two together, and that failed dramatically. What do you see now? Well, you have at least two very contradictory cultures. You still have the same virtue signaling, secularist, progressive worldview, and again, it's located in that part of the country. And then you've got the urban centers of the country, which tend to be the same thing. And then you've got the rural areas or the less populated areas of the country, which tend to be more conservative.
Yeah.
So you have those basic differences. And again, it's all being tried to hold together by mere political process. And unfortunately, I don't think mere political process is ever sufficient to hold cultural differences together. So you have to return to some sort of cultural establishment or a crack up comes. This is what happened to the Soviet Union. So, now we're faced with the Russian Federation, which is a much more monolithic culture than the Soviet Union ever was, nor could be. So this is the first problem. Would Mr. Globaloney therefore like the country to break up? Well, in certain circumstances, yes, because it would be easier to manage smaller, less powerful political units. But on the other hand, that means you have to extend your network of contacts and influencers into all of those breakaway components. And that's difficult to do because you're dealing with people who know outsiders because they're local.
Yeah.
So, where this is going to end up, I don't know. I really don't know. Um, I think the country is in danger, quite honestly, Alex, of flirting with dictatorship. Um, but if it should break up, the other problem that people have to remember is you can throw those dice if you want, but it seldom ends the way you intend for things to happen. Um, that's the problem. And I don't see, quite honestly, I don't see anybody on the political stage with the character or leadership or, for that matter, historical knowledge that comes anywhere close to being able to offer solutions to what we're facing. I just don't see it happening. So, there's always the tried and true solution to solve that difficulty: war.
Right. So you think we're going to be seeing a big war soon?
Well, we're already in it.
Right.
We have been fighting a proxy war with Russia via the Ukraine for several years. And the people paying the price for it is the Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, because they were never going to win that, ever. Militarily, no way. So I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine, Alex.
So do you think those peace talks are going to work out that Trump's having with Putin in Alaska? Or probably not.
Well, no, that's another good question. And here's 0.0001% of me thinks that there's something else going on here. It's so outlandish and so ludicrous, but I'm going to mention it anyway, and everybody can have a good belly laugh at my expense. If you go back in history, most people don't know this, but if you go back in history, again, back to the war between the states, President Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, who, by the way, prior to the war was a very good family friend of Jefferson Davis, of all people. The Secretary of State Seward was, of course, the man that bought Alaska from Russia.
Yeah.
Seward's folly. All right. What was that really about? Well, if you dig and scratch long enough, and I mentioned this in my recent books, if you dig and scratch long enough, what you find out is that both Russia and America were interested in trying to build a channel, like between England and France. Only this one would be between the United States and Russia under the Bering Strait, a railroad connection. Now, imagine just for a moment, and Tsar Nicholas II was on board with that. He even had engineers do practical studies of, what would we need to do that, on the Russian side. So in other words, there's always been this interest in trying to get some sort of link between these two enormous land powers. Now, if just for a moment, imagine that such a link had been made. Imagine the difference in geopolitics today, because this country and Russia would be able to trade directly by an overland route, by rail. That's a relatively good and secure way to move goods and services.
Yeah.
Much more secure than oceans, which is dominated by what world power at the time? Great Britain.
England.
Great Britain. Yep, you betcha. Do they want to see any American Russian rapprochement? Not a chance. Not a chance. By the way, is it really the United States that is trying to keep Russia under some sort of military thumb? Why is Europe so concerned about us getting out of the Ukraine? Well, plop all that down, and now you have President Trump and Putin meeting somewhere in Alaska. I keep noting they haven't told us where yet.
Yeah.
And that to me says, well, okay, they're worried about security. Most obvious place would be Anchorage, maybe Fairbanks, a place with a big airport that they can fly into. But by the same token, I wouldn't be surprised, not at all, if it was some out of the way place like Nome. Okay. And they have their press conference and they make some sort of big announcement. Oh, by the way, yeah, we're talking about ending the war in the Ukraine, but I don't think, in other words, that that's all they're talking about. That's what I'm trying to get at here. I think I think they chose Alaska probably to send messages to everybody else in the world, because Russia, Russia can get along just fine without trading with America. It has, and will continue to do so. But by the same token, if you're Russian, you've got to look at this country and you've got to think, well, it would be better if we got along with them. The problem that we Russians have had in the last 30 years is everything that their governments tell us, they renege and break their word on. So if I were Russia, would I trust this country's government? Not in a heartbeat, would I? So you've got to reestablish some sort of firm basis and ground on which to talk, to continue to talk. We have to talk to Russia. We can't afford not to talk to the biggest nuclear power on the planet. And by the way, that's Russia, not us.
Yeah.
So it's something that has to be done. So I think that there's another agenda that they neither Trump nor Putin are talking about that's behind this meeting. Is the Ukraine going to be front and center on the agenda? Yes, but I would not be a bit surprised that there's something else that they're talking about, and we may even get a hint of what that may be. And again, it's in the backdrop of all of that 19th century discussion between Russia and this country about building out a transcontinental rail link that would end up really being a transglobal rail link. Because if you hook up to the Russian rail network, that means you've got a rail network that spans North America all the way down into Mexico that can connect with that entire rail network grid from Eastern Russia, Siberian Russia, all the way to Europe, all the way to London. That is another Silk Road that even China and all of its plans cannot rival.
You're right about that. That would be a huge
That's that's
trade.
huge. Yeah, yeah. That's a lot of money.
Yeah,
And, you can't tell me that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump aren't thinking in the back of their devious little heads that, hey, we could be making a pile of money here if we could really table all these stupid differences. And would Europe want to see that happen? Well, yeah, it would be beneficial to Europe, but not to the people currently running Europe. That's the other part of the problem.
right.
Because the people currently running Europe are delusional. I don't have any other word for it. They just are delusional.
So why are all these countries in Europe and America too, why are they allowing all this immigration and all this changing? Is this to further the transhumanistic agenda, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, in a very long term way, there's two goals that they have, and I'm going to talk about the general picture from this country to Europe and so on, and then I'm just going to talk about this country. So, in terms of the general goal, their goal is ultimately to change the culture. Why? They hate, let's put it this way, let's put it honestly, they hate Christian culture or anything connected with it. And so long as any vestiges of that culture remain, they are confronted with a culture that ultimately believes in a divine and transcendent principle of action, policy, and morality that they cannot and do not control. That's the big problem. It is much easier to have an irreligious, or for that matter, anti-Christian culture that is much more amenable to central control. Islam, is tailor-made for ideologies of socialism, centralized control, and so on. It looks superficially appealing to them.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. They're doing it for cultural reasons as part of a long-term strategy to eradicate their biggest opposition. The problem that they have is, whoops, the Russians threw the communists out of power and are now building Orthodox churches all over the place at government expense. So
Right.
that little experiment didn't go too well for them. And this is why they hate Russia. And I can say that with some conviction because I'm Eastern Orthodox. I know how the West thinks of orthodoxy, and the problem with Orthodoxy is it's a Catholic Christianity that is not subject to the central control of a pope. That's the problem with it.
Right, that's true.
So, you've got a whole culture that they really can't get a handle on. Now let's look at the United States. Here, the political motivation goal is very different. And again, the war between the states is the key to understanding why they're doing this. Because when you have one particular political party in this country willing to flood the country with immigrants and then count them in the census, what does that do? Well, that enhances that particular political party's representation, not only in the House of Representatives, but also in the Electoral College during presidential elections. That is the goal. Hack, hack those institutions with people that are going to bolster our count. This was precisely the problem that the post-Civil War Republicans in the North faced. Because what happened? Well, we emancipated the slaves. They therefore had to be counted not at three-fifths of a person, according to the original Constitution, but as full persons and given the franchise. So, what really happened as a result of emancipation is politically the Confederacy, once it was reunited with the Union, the Confederacy was in an even more powerful position politically than it was prior to the war, because now you had more people, and more people meant more representation in Congress. So, this was a big problem. This is why Reconstruction in this country was so ugly. And trust me, folks, it was ugly. So, this put the Republicans in a real mess after the war. And that's what's happening now. The Democrats want all these people counted, and they were counted for the purposes of the 2020 census, and therefore for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives and in the Electoral College. This is why Trump wants to redo the census and not count illegal aliens, nor should they be,
Do you
quite
think do
frankly.
you think that's gonna happen, or do you think that's just
No,
some?
I don't think it's just talk. I think it's genuine. Again, because the political realities and the political game that's behind all of this are real. This is part of the cheating process. This is why there's so much ballyhoo, pardon me, over why redistricting is so crucial in places like Texas. Just look at the Democratic states. Massachusetts has a Republican population of about 40%. Is that 40% reflected in 40% of Massachusetts's congressional delegation being Republican? No. There's not a Republican in the Massachusetts congressional delegation. Talk about gerrymandering. There it is.
Yeah,
Your state, again, it's about 40% Republican. Look at your congressional delegation.
right. It's
You
pretty
know,
left wing.
yeah, it's completely bonkers left wing. So yeah, I think they're absolutely deadly serious here about it. And as far as I'm concerned, it's about time the Republicans grew a pair and started fighting back. I've been watching them cave all my life. So I'm I'm glad to see that there's a little fight going on. It's long overdue, and quite frankly, I think it's probably too late overdue, really, to make a difference. But at least try. At least try.
Yeah, I think definitely there is some good Republicans out there, but when I looked at the California State Senate and I looked at Republicans and Democrats, they were all funded by the same people at the
Yeah,
very top. So,
of course. Yeah, of course. There's, the problem. The problem is systemic. There's too much money in the system, and as a result of the political money in the system, the people don't have a voice. And that it's a situation that's going to get worse and worse and worse until it just finally implodes of its own. We're going to go the way every other civilization has, and eventually implode and have to start all over. Um, you know, we were warned, in my opinion, we were warned in the very first paragraph of the very first Federalist paper, which was written by Alexander Hamilton. He did not refer to the country or the government as either a democracy or a republic. He referred to it as an empire.
Hmm.
So, that's reason number one. I have always been, will continue to be an anti-federalist. Um, we have become an empire, and like all empires, we're more concerned with what's going on over there and over there and over there rather than right here at home.
Right.
And, we're going to pay the same price that all empires have always paid.
Imagine if we use half the money that we use for the military on our own country.
Yeah.
It'd be a big help there.
Well, this is the other thing. Look at our military budget, Alex. We're spending billions and trillions of dollars on weapons systems that don't work.
Yeah.
We're not getting near the bang for the buck, or if I can put it this way, nearly the bang for the ruble that Russia is getting for what it spends its military budget on. They're getting real weapons systems that actually are functional, are that work, and that are easily produced. We're showing off ever more sophisticated toys, and here's the problem with sophisticated toys when it comes to the military. They break down more easily and they're more difficult to maintain. So, I think that the military budget is so bloated, we're not even getting the return on our dollars that we should. And that's the other problem. It is too corrupt, it is too entrenched. Uh, you know, give me an updated F-16 rather than this multi-billion dollar monstrosity, whatever it is, the F-35 or whatever it is, that half the time doesn't work
Yeah.
and is not performing as it was advertised to perform.
Right.
And do we need more aircraft carriers?
I don't think
These
so.
gi- these gigantic missile magnets? Come on. Submarines, yeah. Aircraft carriers, no. I shudder to think, what's going to happen to these multi-billion-dollar missile magnets if we get into a shooting war with a country like Russia or China. I really am not looking forward to it. They're missile magnets.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff. I was going to share your website for everybody to see it. I was wondering if you'd like to tell the audience about your newest books, a little bit about them, and
Um, yeah, I thought I had copies of it here, but I guess I don't. I don't know when the last time we've talked was, but there, yeah, there. No, go back to the one with all the pictures that was before that. Yeah, okay. I don't know what books we talked about, but the ones, if you keep it right there, the books that have come out since we talked last, I think, are The Giza Death Star Revisited. Then to the left of that, The Demon in the Acre. And all the way to the left, there's one called The Rialto in Richmond. And there's a new one out. I don't know why the picture's not showing up, but there's, yeah, right there, The Rialto in Richmond Reconstructed. Those two books are the most recent. And those two books, incidentally, were written together. They're meant much more so than almost any of my other books. They're meant to be read together because I pick up the story right at the end of the war between the states and carry it forward a little bit into Reconstruction. As you can tell, the administrations of Andrew Johnson and Ulysses Grant.
yeah, that's pretty cool. How long did it take you to research to do that, to make that book?
Not very long because I've always been interested in the Civil War. It was more a matter of just assembling the necessary sources, to cite rather than do the research. So I'd say for both books together, it was about 6 months. But it was a case of knowing where to look, for getting the books that I use as the sources. But they were I started Rialto and Richmond, and about halfway through, I realized this is going to take another book, so I started writing the second one right away. So they're, in a way that no other books of mine are intended. These were intended as kind of a set, because you're not going to understand the one without the other. They're both essential to the story.
That makes sense. Well, Joseph, I really appreciate all your insight on all these subjects. Uh,
Thanks for having me back.
yeah, and I would like to thank the whole audience for watching, and please check out the Giza Death Star and get Joseph's books. They're really good and they're really great reading. And I'd just like to thank you all for watching. You all have a great day. God bless.